Good afternoon. Welcome to Workforce Pell, an overview. I'm Carrie Wandler, Senior Director of Policy Initiatives for the Midwestern Higher Education Compact, or MEC. Thank you all for joining us today. Before we get started, I wanted to cover some housekeeping items. We're recording this conversation and we'll be posting the recording to our website after the presentation. We welcome questions, but we ask that you use the Q&A box and we will do our best to address the questions as they come in. Mary will post a link to the presentation in the chat. Upon closing out today's meeting, you'll have an opportunity to give us your feedback. Please complete this survey to help us improve all of our future convenings. So many of you are already deep in this work of translating Workforce Pell policy into programs, identifying high demand occupations, eligible programs, and building out application and review processes. With that, I'm pleased to turn it over to our guest speaker. Today, we're joined by Cheryl Dowd, Senior Director of Policy Innovations at WCET and the State Authorization Network, who will provide an overview of Workforce Pell and what states and institutions need to know as implementation moves forward. Cheryl, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Carrie. I appreciate it. I'm honored to be asked to speak with you all today. As Carrie shared, I'm Cheryl Dowd. My position is at WICHE, the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education. One of WICHE's units is WCET, the WICHE Cooperative for Educational Technologies. That's where you'll find me. As Carrie said, I'm the Senior Director for WCET Policy Innovations and the State Authorization Network. And so, before I begin, I just want to make sure that you all are aware that we do not have final regulations on this area yet. We had the proposed regulations for which there was a public comment period. There were approximately 440 public comments submitted, so it's not too many, but it's coming on the heels of the RISE committee that had its public comment opportunities a few weeks before that, and there were about 40,000 comments to go through. So the department is quite busy as they've moved through these, moving from proposed regulations to final regulations. So I just want you to be aware that while we think that the proposed regulations will in essence be what we see in final, want to remind everyone that there were directed questions in the proposed regulations, and it wouldn't surprise us if there are some amending language in the final draft, the final regulations that will be released, we think, late May based on what the department has shared with us. So I also want to point out that I saw the list of institutions and organizations that were joining us today, and I just want to let all of you know I admire many of the organizations and institutions that are providing great work in their analysis of this issue area. And I am very informed by their work as well, so I'm really grateful to them for the work that they do. And it's also a lesson to learn for all of us that there are a lot of good resources out there. We're all still trying to get our arms around what the processes will be to move forward. And I strongly urge for us to remember that those are secondary sources. The things that we put out, the things that other organizations put out are secondary sources. And I encourage you to have somebody at your institution or organization reading the primary source. So for that reason, I've provided hyperlinks in this slide deck, and the slide deck will be available. But I put in the hyperlinks for the statute where the language for the development of Workforce Pell came from, and also for the regulations that are in only proposed form. So let's dive in. Okay, so this is my name and this is my email. Please feel free to contact me with any follow-up. So just a little bit more of, how we're going to proceed through today. That was part of the welcome. I'm going to take a few minutes to frame this moment. Why are we here now? What is this that we're discussing? Where did it come from, and why are we addressing it now? So we're going to talk about what exactly is Workforce Pell. We'll talk about the federal regulatory structure. And we'll talk about the emphasis that we're seeing on the state's role for the purposes of Workforce Pell. And we'll talk about what institutions can do now. We'll do a wrap up, take questions, and then I'll give you a little bit of a preview of what's going to be in the part two of this webinar. This is a part one to show the overview, and I'm very pleased that I'll be back with a set of panelists for part two to talk about implementation strategies by states and institutions. So let's just take a step back here initially and talk about what the key aspects are of Pell Grants, because they're a very specific thing. So they're a need-based financial aid for undergraduates, not for graduate programs, and it's need-based financial aid that does not require repayment. It is debt-free aid. And so it's for the folks that need it the most. Eligibility is generally based on a family income of under 60,000 in the last year. And the maximum amount of aid in this academic year, we understand, is less than $7,500. That's for an academic year. So we're talking about this amount of money per person in an academic year. There is a lifetime limit and a maximum of 12 terms. Historically, the traditional minimums was for at least 15 weeks. So what we're discussing today is something that is going to expand the opportunity for Pell Grants because it had a minimum cutoff that we are now seeing an expansion. And we have to point out that students must complete the FAFSA to be eligible for Pell Grants. So where did this whole idea of having something that provides a shorter period of time to be Pell eligible? Well, you all will recall this time last year was the discussions leading up to the enactment of federal legislation, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OB3 as often is called. So this was a massive legislation addressing taxing and spending in many policy areas and was enacted, as I said, July 4th, 2025. So pertaining to higher education specifically, we saw three big areas: loan limitations and Title IV eligibility. That was the RISE committee that was going to address the implementation of that. Pell Grants, including Workforce Pell, we're talking today, and institutional and program accountability. And as I say there at the bottom, then we have this federal statute, and then we have the Department of Education as an administrative agency developing the processes to implement the higher education portions of the statute. Those of you will remember that the administrative agencies have to get either direct or implied direction to be able to create regulations that come from statute. That's where the administrative agents get their authority in order to create regulations from, and in this case, OB3, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So again, about negotiated rulemaking, to be able to implement, just generally speaking, just a little reminder that agencies are directed by the Administrative Procedure Act, which is federal statute, for the process to develop regulations. And the key elements of the Administrative Procedure Act is notice and opportunity for comment, for public comment. But differently, in addition to the Higher Education Act, also federal statute, indicates that there's additional steps for rulemaking for the purposes of Title IV financial aid related regulations. That's where we come in with this notion of negotiated rulemaking. So it's in addition to what's in the Administrative Procedure Act. So this includes, this negotiated rulemaking is when they bring together key stakeholders to meet and develop the language with the consensus as the goal of the rulemaking committee. Well, why is that important? Well, consensus is not necessarily 100% agreement, but it's no one dissenting. So no one can dissent from the language that has been a part of this stakeholder group, including the federal negotiator, in the development of consensus. If the rulemaking committee does not reach consensus, then in this case, the Department of Education will write the rule for purposes of the proposed regulation. If it reaches consensus, primarily The consensus language will become the proposed regulation that is subject to public comment. That doesn't mean that rules that reach consensus then will then move to be the final language. No, it doesn't. It goes to the proposed language such that the department can learn from the public comments in the development of the final rule. Typically, with negotiated rulemaking, is in statute the idea of the master calendar rule. And the master calendar rule, we're talking about financial aid here. So the master calendar rule indicates that if a final regulation is reached by November 1, it becomes effective the following July. However, in this situation, we have a statute that specifically directed that this is to be enacted, or excuse me, this is to be effective by July 1 of 2026. So what we have here, I've heard many explanations, but what I recall from learning about principles of conflict of law is that when you have a specific law like OB3 directing the effective date over the over a general rule of the master calendar rule, which generally that is supposed to be the structure for the effective date, then the direct and the specific wins out, meaning that we will have effective rules on workforce Pell by July 1 of 2026. So if you're wondering when the final rule will come out, I put a little timing tip here. So we watch the OMBOIRA website, and they have a place there, and that link is live, to look at the Executive Order 12866 regulatory review. And that is the last stop for draft regulations before they are released by an agency. And so for the proposed rules, they were offered there. The executive branch has their review, gives their notes to the administrative agency. The agency then releases in the proposed form, and then again in the final form. These rules for workforce Pell have not yet gone to OMBOIRA, where they will sit for probably about 3 weeks-ish while they take meetings to review what is a part of the draft package. And I will tell you that the RISE committee rules just went to OMB for this EO 12866 regulatory review. They just went last Friday. So if we're going in any sort of order, the RISE committee will take its meetings for several weeks, and then we will see the rules for workforce Pell and Pell eligibility to be reviewed. So we are going to see late May, early June probably for these workforce Pell regulations to be released as final. So what is workforce Pell? So through the OB3, we saw something that was of bipartisan interest. You may have recalled in reviewing the Chronicle, Inside Higher Ed, etc., that there has been bipartisan interest in short-term Pell for quite a while. So what we have here is something that was of interest to develop something that's very work related. So it's Pell eligibility for programs less than 15, and they determine in 18 to 14 weeks in length. So it's to encourage education related to employment training. So the programs must meet specific statutory requirements, including accountability measures, in order for them to be an approved program. The institutions, it was written into statute, must be accredited, because there was discussion in the earlier version of the bill that they didn't necessarily have to be accredited, but that was in the final language that the institutions must be accredited. They can be non-credit programs, but they have to be from an accredited institution. And they must be approved by the state to be aligned with in-demand jobs. This is in statute. Also in statute is that it must be stackable to lead to a credential. And then finally, there had been discussion over a variety of years about the short-term Pell and whether it would be permissible to use distance education. And yes, it was determined that distance education is a permissible modality, and there had been discussion over the years about whether there could be sector-specific rules around the idea of it couldn't be offered by a for-profit institution. That was not part of this final statute. The statute language includes that it can be any sector, and it is distance education is a permissible modality. I do want to point out here that right down here at the bottom is some is the hyperlink to get to the language that's in statute specifically. And so I do urge you all to review that part of the One Big Beautiful Bill that talks about extending federal Pell Grant eligibility. And I say that because this is not a new financial aid program. It merely expands the availability of Pell to a short-term program. So that means that they would have to use the Pell proration rules. And if any of you, like myself, also follow Thomson Coburn, they did the math on this to say that, at a maximum, it looks like it would be less than $2,000 per term when you consider the size of the program, and pertaining to what the amount could be for a maximum for Pell, to a student. So you may have heard about, I think everyone's using it, about is the juice worth the squeeze? So this is going to be a determination by institutions, whether they think this is something they want to pursue, given the work that will have to go into it for the review of the program and determination of how to move forward. And also, to be really clear, this is not a new pot of funds. This is coming from the larger Pell pot, if you will. And so you may have heard discussions lately about there's a Pell shortfall. So, we have to consider that in terms of, how is this going to work in terms of managing of Pell dollars as we move forward. Okay, so we had the statute. Now we have the Department of Education building the federal regulatory structure. And I want to point out something really important is that because the statute was very direct and specific, the Department of Education has some limitations in terms of its ability to have any discretion about how it is structured. So there is a little bit of discretion, but there is also very much direction from the statute in the development of the regulations. So I'm going to talk about and note here, I have hyperlinked the proposed regulations that had been released in March and March 9, and the comment period ended on April 8. So it hasn't been that long. And as I said, we're getting the RISE committee going through first, and then we will see the proposed, the final regulations rather, for this section of the rulemaking. So what we're going to talk about are key components. Key components were program eligibility requirements. We're going to talk about state and governor approval requirements. We're going to address the fact that the states play and the governor play a big role in the development of workforce Pell programs. And we're going to talk about definitions that align with WIOA definitions. That was an important aspect. And we'll talk about accountability and outcomes-based oversight, because a program, once chosen, will have to be reviewed in order to remain a part of the program moving forward. And then which is what I indicate in the final bullet about reapproval of programs. Okay, so we'll start first with the program eligibility requirements. So the duration lasts at least 18 weeks, but fewer than 15 weeks. And so we're talking about only 150 to 599 clock hours of instruction or credit that's equivalent. It must be an accredited institution that's Title IV eligible. So an accredited institution to provide the programs. It can be not a non-credit program, however. So the experience of the program must have been operating for at least 1 year. And I have heard others with this analysis talk about how institutions may want to review what kind of certificate programs they may already have in place that might be able to be eligible for this program. The credential value leads to a stackable, portable, industry recognized credential. So that is of great importance. And we'll talk about when you have to address the accountability measures about how it can be a stackable situation, but it really is intended to get these folks, directly into the kind of employment that is supported by this education. And then alignment authorized by a state workforce board to ensure that it serves that high skill in demand industries. So it's not really talking about the higher education agencies, it's somebody directly addressing state workforce, which some states already have in place. And then it must meet outcome standards. We'll talk very specifically about that. I want to talk just a quick second about disqualified programs. So programs that cannot be eligible for these Pell Grant programs. It's the correspondence courses, programs that are less than 150 clock hours, programs that are not aligned with state verified in-demand jobs, and remedial courses. So those are the things that are not eligible for these workforce Pels. So accountability. So this is a tricky one, and I'll be really honest with you. This is something that I'm still trying to get my arms around. And I want to tell you right up front that that some of this will have an onboarding capability. So when we talk, I'll talk about that when I get to that particular area. But just to be clear, there will have to be outcome standards and accountability measures, and they're designed to ensure federal funds support these programs that provide a direct return on investment for students, ensuring they obtain meaningful employment. So you see that tie between the aid and the employment. So let's start with the completion rate. So they must have at least 70% of students complete the program within 150% of the normal program length. Then we look at the job placement rate. It has to be at least 70% of program completers must find employment in the field for which they were trained within 180 days. There's an on-ramp for that. So for the purposes of job placement rate, it's that the completers must find employment not necessarily in the field for the first 3 years, but within 180 days. So there is some flexibility in the first few years about employment until beyond 28, 29. So there's an earning thresholds, a return on investment test. The median earnings of the completers must exceed their total tuition and fees, with earnings measured against a benchmark of 150% of the federal poverty level. So we will see more communication about those data points. Validation period. Programs must be in operation, as I shared before, for at least 1 year before becoming eligible. That doesn't mean at this point that institutions are developing brand new programs. They may be, but there could be things for which the institution already has in place in certificate programs that could be applicable to this structure. And then it's going to be the state's responsibility. I can't underscore enough about how this was developed in order for it to be a state-led structure that is then approved by the Department of Ed in order for Pell eligibility. So the governors hold a very important role as being responsible for certifying that the programs meet the standards. And then with federal verification for some metrics starting in the 29-30 year, which I was addressing before as being beyond 28-29. So as I said, there's some on-ramp as the institutions and the states are developing their structure to be able to offer this to students. So emphasizing the state role. So here I am again. I'm talking about how important this is a state-directed process. Congress was very clear that they wanted this to be a state-led opportunity. So it requires state government approval requirements. So as I said, state-directed process. So the states, typically under the authority of the governor, are expected to define which are the qualifying programs, have to be of a high wage, high demand, or in some cases, high skill area that is of importance in the state. So what we're seeing here is that I had the pleasure of listening to our colleagues in Pennsylvania talk about their structure and how they are determining which of the programs are fitting this category for Pennsylvania, which could be very different perhaps from the types of programs that are in demand for employment in perhaps Colorado. So what we see here, it's going to be very state specific. States are going to have discretion to make determinations on labor market data, how they are addressing that, and determining, as I was sharing before, about these workforce priorities. So, and governors or state entities will then approve and renew the specific programs. And it's going to be in the governor's and state's role to establish this framework or this process for eligibility of programs and then the renewal of these programs. So this is going to be very state specific. And so this is why, we found it very important as we look at how the structure is to be put in place, is to speak with some of our colleagues from states that are getting out ahead of this and are developing it as a priority in their states. And that will provide us with some direction with, how do we look at their structure and see then what might be applicable in developing structures in other states. So to underscore this, the federal framework really relies on state validation rather than being a federal approval of these programs. So Congress really wanted that there be this state first decisions before they are approved to be able to be eligible for Pell. So again, I think you're getting the message. Cheryl thinks that it's important that states are leading the way here. And, the governor's role is really as a gatekeeper of workforce Pell eligibility. It's a federal framework that we've discussed, but then it's state determinations of how they want to implement it, so that there really is a shared governance model. The states make determinations that then go to the secretary to then be reviewed for approval. So it's really important that we understand that, we had statute and then federal regulations setting the structure for the states to determine what is the applicability. So you may be saying to yourself, well, Cheryl, there's going to be then 50 plus different structures when you consider all the states and territories and the District of Columbia. And you will be right. So state variability actually is a feature. It's not a flaw because we do see that the states vary. And so we are going to see different occupation lists, program approval structure, and processes across states. That's why I'm very interested in the next webinar that will follow our webinar here today to talk about how states are going to do things differently, because I think we're really going to be amazed at the structures that they develop, and we're going to be able to see, what are the priorities in these individual states, and it will make sense once we learn, what those priorities are. So let's talk a little bit about interstate distance education. So I've talked to multiple institutions that are primarily distance education entities that provide distance education across the country. So we're wondering, well, how does this work? Yes, we have institutional approval through reciprocity, by the reciprocity agreement we all know as SARA, the State Authorization Reciprocity Agreement. But that's for institutional approval. And what we're talking about here is program approval, which is distinct. So institutions will need to have institutional approval to offer programs in another state. But in order for them to be Workforce Pell eligible, there's also going to have to be program approval. So there was significant discussion during the rulemaking about how it wasn't addressed by Congress specifically how you would deal with interstate distance education, but it was really clear that they were intending to have this be state specific. So in that situation, the Department of Education during rulemaking indicated that they would be comfortable with bilateral agreements. So by bilateral agreements, meaning that two states could create this opportunity because they have common interests, common goals, to be able to have the institution offer the program, not only in the state where the institution's located, but also in this adjacent state, often probably, or other states who have similar interests and needs. So it was not expanded beyond bilateral agreements in the proposed regulations. But I want to point out that that was one of the directed questions. So I am anticipating that the department is having discussions about whether it can be more than bilateral agreements. I do not know how that conversation is going, but in the proposed regulations, it was limited to bilateral agreements because during rulemaking, they indicated that the multilateral would undermine congressional intent for state-specific determinations. So we'll have to see how that works. They were looking for those to have creative solutions to be able to offer programs in multiple states without having these multi-bilateral agreements that are then provided by disclosure for folks to have knowledge of program approval for Workforce Pell. And I want to point out there's another level of program approval. If this is a program that leads to a professional license or certification, then there would need to be perhaps, depending on the state and the profession or occupation, there may need to be approval in that state because it's part of the licensing board structure and oversight. And so it could be multiple layers of approvals. You would have either state to state institutional approval or through SARA, then program approval for purposes of workforce Pell, and then finally certification or licensure could require some sort of approval by the state if required by that state. So please keep these levels of approval in separate buckets, but know that that is a situation if you're an institution that is going to offer things or intending to offer things in multiple states. Okay, so what can institutions do now? Okay, I think it's really important to have these discussions at your institution so that you know what's coming. We don't have final rules yet. I would bet a month from now we have final rules, or approximately a month from now. I will tell you that in listening to and reading many of the other sources out there, that they have encouraged institutions to not be rushing. I know that I've heard the secretary indicate that, there is a competition building up of programs that wish to be the first one approved. Great. Perhaps they have those programs already in place so that they are programs that can move more quickly. But if you're not an institution that has a program that is really on the cusp, I would encourage you not to rush and do well for our students as opposed to rushing to be approved. So that being said, you want to build internal awareness. You want to help your leadership align, be aligned on Workforce Pell as a policy shift and looking at how we are addressing the opportunities for Pell Grants for these shorter term programs. It's not a new aid program. It is an extension, but it could have an impact at your institution should you wish to pursue it. You're going to want to monitor federal rulemaking and focus on the direction of policy, especially as it relates to accountability and the outcomes, because that is going to be really important for programs you choose to be approved and then reapproved. You're going to need to engage at the state level. So certainly at this point, we're in the infancy stages of this, right? So there are some states that are taking the lead and moving at a quick pace, and I think that's fabulous. And we're going to hear from them in just a couple weeks. So you're going to want to talk with them, track and participate in those conversations that are going to shape what is determined as eligible occupations for your state and the programs that could be tied to those occupations. Then you're going to want to develop your institutional perspective. So again, this is not a one-person job. This is something that you're going to have multiple folks, part of a group that is addressing how you move forward on this at your institution. So you're going to want to have someone, a group of people who are identifying risks and opportunities. And also look at, and I was suggesting before, look at the courses and programs that you've already developed to see what might fit in this structure. And also, this is going to be probably at the very senior level, determining how this aligns with the mission of the institution. So there are a lot of questions that your institution is going to want to have about how you would like to move forward with this new opportunity. So you're going to define your key questions and be ready to engage with policymakers at your institution and in your state to determine the clarity and intent of your next steps. So in terms of a wrap up, I just, as we close, just wanted to indicate that this moment actually is less about immediate action and more about intentional positioning. So if you have not moved and already have programs identified, I would strongly urge you to have these conversations at your institutions about how you want to be positioned to address workforce Pell. So it represents a meaningful shift in how federal financial aid can be structured because of this expansion. So, as we focus on short-term programs and its connection to workforce outcomes, we see that this is a new opportunity. So just as importantly, it introduces a model where states play a central role in determining what qualifies. So we're really looking forward to seeing, where across this country are we having specific need for specific types of occupations for which our students could then, who are going to be pursuing this, will be in a better place for employment. So that combination of federal framework with state-defined elements is something that we have not typically seen at this scale in Title IV programs. So this is a really interesting collaborative development, for the support of people in the states. So for institutions, it's an important step right now. So you're going to not only build new processes, you're going to look at how you stand up new programs. So it's to ensure that your institution understands the direction of the policy and is prepared to engage as it continues to take shape. So this is going to take conversation about how we do these programs and how we are going to assess their success in terms of the data we collect. So it means building awareness internally, staying close to federal developments, and paying particular attention to what's happening in your state. So that state interaction is the element that we were discussing a few minutes ago that is going to be key. So it means taking the time to develop your own institutional perspective. So even institutions in the same state may have a different view of how they wish to pursue or not pursue this new opportunity. So you're going to have to determine within your institution if it aligns with the mission and where you have questions or concerns about its implementation. Because in many ways, the institution will be best positioned are those that are not reacting, that they're taking the time to be informed and engaged throughout. So again, as I was sharing just a few minutes ago, other sessions that I have heard on these topics have really gotten to the point that they are telling people, don't rush. If you are not in a position to have programs that are immediately fitting this structure, let's take our time to do it well. And so, I'm very excited to say that we are going to have a next session, as I said, coming up on May 14, that will shift from understanding the policy that we've discussed today, the federal policy through statute and regulation, to explore what this could mean next for institutional strategy and readiness. So I just want to share with you here that the next session on May 14 is going to get into that, well, how do we do it? So we have been discussing today what it is, what is the framework that the federal government set up for states to then take the next step to build, and then for institutions to be able to provide opportunities for students. So you'll see here the finer points of what this next session will provide. And we have a great group of panelists. We'll have Lynette Kuhn, the Deputy Secretary and Commissioner for Post-Secondary education from Pennsylvania Department of Education, and I had just heard her recently speak about how they are working in Pennsylvania, and I think you're going to really get a lot out of this. Cynthia Proctor is the Director of Communications and Academic Policy Development for the Office of the Provost at the SUNY system in New York. And I had the pleasure of being the moderator on a panel that she was serving, talking about how SUNY is addressing this for their system in New York. So I think that's going to be fabulous. And we have Amy Schaefer, Senior Director, Legal Services and Program Implementation from the Ohio Department of Higher Education. And then finally, Leroy Wade, who is the Deputy Commissioner for Missouri Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development. So we have three states sharing their insights about how they will move forward. So I think we're going to gain a lot from that. So at this time, I would love to take questions. I think that Carrie may have some direction, but I will ask you that if you have questions that are specific to implementation, that you hold those until we have our team with us to discuss implementation in a couple weeks. But I'm happy to take questions about what the rule says and what we might anticipate the rule to finally be. And I will tell you that if it is a nuanced question, I'm very happy to take it back and work on it to provide a thorough response to your question. So I'm going to turn it back to Carrie.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cheryl. You have just such a talent for making very complex things seem easy and just very simple to follow. So I appreciate that. There was a question that I think was inserted in the chat as you were speaking, so I didn't want to interrupt you, but it was about accreditation. I believe someone typed in, does the type of accreditation matter? Which I assume is pointing to institutional versus programmatic or specialized. I don't know if you have an answer to that, but I did want to acknowledge that question first.
Sure. So the institution has to be an accredited institution, but I would, extend that to say that if it is the type of program that requires programmatic accreditation, then that would be the additional point. But I will say on the general notion, the institution has to be institutionally accredited.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And again, we're taking questions in the Q&A box. So if you wouldn't mind typing out your questions there so we can try to triage them as we go through. So I do have a question here asking if there is a limit on the number of times that an individual can receive Workforce Pell. So can a student over a lifetime receive Workforce Pell for multiple programs, recognizing that it will impact their eligibility to receive Pell for a degree program?
So I do think, and I think there are others on this call who, can add into the chat, their understanding. But my understanding is that there is a maximum amount of Pell that is that can be attributed to an individual person, and that it cannot be something that would be for graduate programs. So if there are others who have more, I saw that NASFA folks are registered for this, but it's my understanding that you have a lifetime cap, and it cannot be graduate. You cannot have already achieved a graduate degree in order to pursue Workforce Pell. But I think it has to do with the amount cap for Pell eligibility. There we go. Oh, no, that's a question. Never mind.
Okay,
Somebody
well,
added a question into the chat. Sorry.
yeah. No, that's fine. Let me just read it for the sake of the transcript. So we do have a question in the chat asking if a program has been operating for more than 12 months, but does not currently meet the eligibility requirements, would modifying the program to comply with Workforce Pell requirements allow it to satisfy the 12-month operating requirement?
So it's my understanding that it has to be having that if you shift it, then that is not a program that. So, and again, I look forward to others being able to supply into this, but as I understood it, that then that would not be a program that could move forward because it's something that you have already modified. And
So
then
that,
thank Thank you to someone who added that the workforce Pell does count towards the maximum 12 semesters of eligibility, so it has to do with the cap, not the number of different workforce Pell programs pursued.
Yes, terrific. Thank you. Um, so we do have a question in the Q&A as well. Let me click on this. The 70% employment rate for the workforce Pell recipients can serve as a disincentive for continued education. Do you have a sense the department may be willing to address this in the current rulemaking?
That's a really good question. And that is something that I've had conversations about because if they have put in statute that is to be stackable, but it is a disincentive for the institution to encourage continued education, there seems to be a disconnect. So I would hope that in public comments that disconnect was addressed. Because it does seem to the idea of it being stackable to a degree seems to be undermined by the fact that you have to have the employment rate of 100 of the time frame, immediately following the completion of the program.
Yes, I appreciate that. I know we've been getting questions in our different roundtable discussions regarding that as well.
And I have heard multiple sessions, like your roundtable, discussing about how that doesn't seem to really align well.
Mhm.
So, how does that work if, or if it's going to cause a difficulty to the institution to maintain the program, why would you want it to be in that way? And I've heard too that institutions should not be too worried if a program is not eligible for workforce Pell, it's not been renewed, it can still be offered. It's just that it's not Pell eligible until that renewal period has passed and it can become a program that's eligible for Pell again.
Mm. Yeah, that's very helpful. The stackability, right, I think was just very puzzling to lots of folks when we were talking through this.
Sure. It does not encourage continued education.
Hmm. Absolutely. Let me just ask a more general question in that vein. So you've had the chance to talk to different kinds of folks about this, and I'm just kind of curious about what you think, because part of our kind of, as both of the compacts, right? Part of our charge is sometimes kind of myth busting, right? Like we'll give the information, but also what is likely to be misunderstood, or what are some misconceptions out there about workforce Pell. I don't know if you have any, that you just off the top of your head that you might want to point to. I'm sure that you covered some, or you tried to cover some with clarity in your presentation, but I'm just kind of curious about that.
Sure. Probably the misconception, it's because I live in this world of state authorization, is the misconception that Sarah will just take care of all of it in terms of interstate opportunities. And, just want to be really clear, every other presentation I've heard is very clear as well, in that reciprocity or state to state institutional approval is a part of the interstate capability of the program, but it's not just, I mean, you have to have the institutional approval, but this workforce Pell program approval is its own thing. It's its own bucket. And so for people to make sure that they're clear that they're going to have that, as well as if there is some sort of professional licensure responsibility, that they're addressing that as well. So it could be that there's a certification that is along with whatever type of certification is aligned with that occupation that they're training for.
Mm. No, that's very helpful. We still do have some time, so if you have some questions, please do put them in the Q&A box. I know that in our previous discussions, also we had some question around how sta if there were guidelines or advice about states thinking about defining in demand and high wage in ways that are both rigorous but also can flex with need as it changes over time. I don't know if that's obviously not something that's baked into these rules, but it really is in people's minds in terms of the long-term play here, right? Not just the short term, let's get something so we can get it out the door, but really how it's meant to flex and meet the needs of an evolving workforce.
Right. And so, and this is something that I know that at least one of the presenters in a couple of weeks will address in their state because they're having some discussions about, well, what does that mean? And what is going to be our bar
Mhm.
to determine what those in demand, high skill, high need occupations in the state. So I think they're going to be looking at data of, what they see for employment in the states to make that determination. So I think you're going to see institutions create the calculus, to determine, what those occupations are going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think we have a question or kind of a re request for clarification here. I do believe it's in the chat, so you may be able to read it as
Mhm.
well. But I'm asking for clarification for a certain part of the rule that would allow an otherwise eligible student with a bachelor's degree to receive a Pell Grant to enroll in an eligible workforce program. If a school only offers certificates of completion, i.e. welding, does the program qualify? Does that seem so if the outcome must be stackable to a degree program?
That's a very good question. Trying to determine, what are these very specific skill-based certificate programs going to be built into? And so, I'm really curious. I think this is a very good question to bring back to our panelist who will be in a few weeks from SUNY in looking at some of these, as I said, very specific skill based and how they will address it being stackable into a degree program. So I'd rather not try to take a stab at it and suggest that you really hold that question. And actually, I'll be in touch with this panelist in advance to share that because I think she'd be very interested.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that question. Yes, and so that means you have to come back on May 14th to hear
I
the
strongly urge it.
yes,
Yes.
the sage advice of the panel that we'll have brought together on this. Wonderful. I know
So
this is,
Carrie,
go ahead.
I just really want to underscore the importance of folks coming back because you have seen any number of different organizations and the higher education press, if you will, providing analysis of the rules. And so, and I'm a fan, you all, those of you who know me know I'm a big fan of the Thompson Coburn work as well. And so, I lean into, how I'm, one of those, if they talk, I listen, about how they provide analysis. But it's going to be really important to see what states decide in terms of how to create this structure and then how institutions will move forward with it. So
Yeah.
sorry, Carrie, I just really want to sell this May 14 session because I think it's really going to be critical.
Yes. No, absolutely. I'm so glad that you are pointing to that. Out of curiosity, do you think that there's any like issues or challenges that you'd like to see us dig into, just in terms of you talking through this with implementation folks, what kinds of things are we looking for guidance on so that we can also start to craft, I think, a framework for that webinar and that particular panel of experts.
Well, I think it is going to be really important to learn how states are determining, what kinds of employment needs there are in the state. So they can the states are going to be giving the direction of what they think that their constituency needs. And so institutions are going to have to be paying attention to that in terms of whether their programs, now their programs may be great programs, but it's just whether they're going to be eligible for workforce pell. They're still going to want to perhaps offer programs because they see a need in their community, but perhaps they aren't considered by the state to be amongst their key areas. So looking to the state to create what is going to be the structure, what is going to be how the institution pursues approval for the particular programs. What does that look like? So I think people are wanting to look at the granular level of, well, what are the steps? What's a checklist going to look like for an institution to put their work together to get it approved by the state for it then to get approved then by the department.
Yeah, terrific. I know it's such a unique position because everyone's lined up at the start line, right? It is kind of like a foot race, but we know that some states are very eager to get out of the gate quick and get things rolling and build process and re revise process as necessary, while other states are strategically thinking about hanging back a little bit and learning some best practices as they start to emerge through this iterative revision. And so, yeah, it'll be good. I'm glad that for the next panel too, that we have some states in our Midwest region, but then also we have that out of region view as well, I think. And I thank you for helping us helping us get that perspective.
Oh, those are some great people that you have. So I think it's going to be wonderful.
Well, I think you've given everyone quite a bit to think about. They're out of questions, or the questions are so in depth that we're going to save them for next time. But either way, I wanted to thank you again. I mean, I just can't say enough about you and your work and just the generosity that you show in sharing your time and expertise with us. Really, it's a pleasure to have you, and it'll be a pleasure to have you again in just a few weeks' time.
Thank you. I was so honored to be asked, really. So thank you.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. As a reminder to the audience, please complete our survey. So the survey will be available when you exit this webinar, and the link will also be provided in the chat. We've already posted the presentation for your review, so we'll be also posting the recording of today's event soon after we close out here. And as we've mentioned several times now, we will be hosting the part two of this webinar on May 14th at 11 a.m. Central Time. We hope you'll plan to join us as we build on today's overview and take a deeper dive into implementation in practice. So you'll hear directly from state agencies and system leaders as they share approaches to program identification, approval processes, and cross-agency collaboration. The panelists will also discuss key challenges, lessons learned, and strategies for aligning stakeholders to advance implementation under tight deadlines, as we know. So we've placed a link in the chat to register for that upcoming event. And if you're interested in keeping informed with MEC by subscribing to our website, I believe there's information there as well. So thank you again. Thank you to Cheryl, and thank you to the collected audience here. We hope we answered some questions, and those we can't answer right now. I think we'll have a good group collected on May 14th to continue the conversation. So thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you in a few weeks' time. Take care.